Good afternoon. Welcome to Founders Day 2016 at the Huntington. We're delighted to have you here this afternoon. Glad you're here. My name is Randy Schulman. I'm the Vice President for Advancement here at the Huntington, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. For those who may or may not know why we have Founders Day every year in observance of somewhere around Mr. Huntington's birthday, but we do this every year to try to take an institutional look at one thing or another that we're working on here at the Huntington. And this year I'm pleased that we have our Hannah and Russell Kully, Director of the Art Collections, Kevin Salatino, here as our speaker. And Kevin came to the Huntington in 2012. In that time, much has happened. You're going to see it before your eyes and hear from Kevin directly. But this has been a time of many exciting changes at the Huntington, and the term exciting changes is well overused in society, not at the Huntington. On the art side, if you think about the acquisitions, the new spaces, the new ways of interpreting things, it is among the most exciting times that we've ever had, and it's only getting started. So a little bit about Kevin's background. Before Kevin came to the Huntington, he was at Bowdoin College, and he was the director of the art collections there and the gallery there. He also had previous life in Los Angeles, both with the Getty Research Institute and at LACMA. So his relationship with Southern California and with California art and with American art and with art of Europe and the world is very, very well known and solid. Kevin has some side projects that he's done while he's been involved here, including one that has a publication, and I just want to read it to you. It is called The Representation of Fireworks in Early Modern Europe, published in a revised and expanded French edition in 2015. Well, I've seen it. It's fabulous. There was also an exhibit that manifests with live fireworks within the exhibit. Imagine that. But the thing that I really want to call your attention to, this year we produced a book at the Huntington called Blue Boy and Company. Blue Boy and Company is one of the first times that we've really taken a walk through our European collections and talked about both the history and what the great pieces are now that are on display for the public. If you have not had a chance to look at that publication, we sell it. It's beautiful. It's Blue Boy up close, and it was a singular achievement of Kevin and his staff. So there are many, many other things, and rather than take his thunder, I just would like to give a warm welcome to Kevin Salatino. Please join me.
Thank you, Randy. Can everyone hear me? I'm pretty loud. Okay. So for those of you who were paying attention to my subtitle, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? You may have recognized its origin. Now, this is a red herring, needless to say, having nothing to do with Henry or Arabella Huntington's collecting or with the future of art at the Huntington. Boston's Museum of Fine Arts is quite happy with it. But it may be of interest as an historical factoid that Arabella, with her husband Collis, was in Paris the very year Where Do We Come From was painted, although it wasn't sent to Paris by Gauguin, who had painted it in Tahiti, until the following year. Of course, Arabella did not frequent the gallery of the avant-garde dealer Ambroise Vollard, so it would have made no difference if it had been in Paris in 1897. So there's absolutely no what if here. Okay, now warming to our subject. I'd like to engage here in a thought experiment, and yes, the screen is deliberately black. I'd like you to imagine two paintings side by side, each approximately the same size, relatively small, vertical in format, one painting containing two figures, the other containing one figure. In each, the background is flat and monochromatic. In each, the figures, or figure, leaned to the right of the composition and fill the frame from edge to edge as if contained snugly within a just large enough box. In each, the figures, or figure, are pressed up against the picture plane, thus gaining a spatial immediacy or intimacy with the viewer. In each, texts play a critical role, although in one, the text, while present, is hidden, or rather closed, though it is essential to the picture's meaning and interpretation. In each, there is present the proleptic or predictive implication of some future event, a consummation, as it were, of an action that has not yet taken place. There's also something simultaneously joyous and sad in each of them. Both paintings have the sacred at their core. That is, they are each iconic images meant to encourage, or at the very least, suggest a worshipful stance on the part of the beholder. For both, gold is an important color, intended to signify the picture's preciousness, its removal from the common world. Both use stylized floral patterns as a decorative motif. Both would be instantly recognizable to the vast majority of their viewers, their mass-produced images so common as to be banal. Both are paintings in the European tradition of exacting realism that follow the Western rules of perspective and a pronounced devotion to verisimilitude. Both are painted on traditional grounds or surfaces, one on panel, the other on canvas, and use traditional mediums, one oil, the other casein. Both are painted by hand and not created using mechanical means of production. Their makers, highly industrious artists with large workshops, would have felt perfectly at home with one another, emerging as they do from the same tradition and utilizing the same visual and technical vocabulary, as well as a remarkably consistent iconography, albeit utilized for different ends. So, what are these two paintings, and who are these two painters? Separated by almost exactly 500 years, Roger van der Weyden's Virgin and Child, from about 1460, and Andy Warhol's Small Crushed Campbell's Soup Can, from 1962, represent more or less the beginning and more or less the end of Western painting as we knew it for half a millennium. What they also underline, or frame as it were, is both the widely encompassing arc as well as the consistency of the Huntington's collections as they have evolved through time. Indeed, a policy statement of 1925, signed by Mr. Huntington, maintained that, quote, "It only remains in the future to extend the range of the collection by the gradual addition of other great masters of British and American art." By American art, Henry would have meant paintings like John Singleton Copley's The Western Brothers on the left, or Benjamin West's Lear and Cordelia on the right. Among the small but distinguished group of American paintings and furniture that the Huntingtons acquired in their lifetime, although of course they would have considered both artists Anglo-American, works that paralleled and complemented their British collection by the acknowledged masters of the 18th and 19th centuries, according to the terms of American art history as they were understood in the early years of the 20th century. Needless to say, Mr. or Mrs. Huntington would not have been able to make any sense of works of art like Andy Warhol's Soup Can or his Brillo box from 1964, both received as gifts to the Huntington in 2010. Interestingly, almost exactly a century after Henry acquired, through Arabella's intercession, one of the finest objects in the Huntington's collection. This double-gourd Celadon vase with French gilt bronze mounts, acquired in 1911. A merging of Yuan dynasty China and Louis XV France that is arguably as strange in its cultural hybridity as Warhol's Brillo box is, or was in 1964, in its cheeky insistence to be taken seriously as a work of art. Indeed, the Brillo box now, more than 50 years after its creation, is beginning to look almost as archaic and artifactual to us as the double-gourd vase. The gift, then, of the two Warhols, painting and sculpture, in 2010 was among the most significant gifts of art in the Huntington's post-Henry history. And though Henry would not have understood either of these objects, Campbell's Soup Can or Brillo box, what he would have understood was the subtle, even provocative reasoning behind these gifts and why those gifts were accepted, even subversive reasoning behind these gifts and why they were accepted. And that, above all, was Huntington's great strength, visionary at its core, his ability to weigh the significance of any decision against the future of his great project. And here, because it's germane, let me tell you the story of the origin of the Huntington Desert Garden. You're seeing two early slides, the house at the top. In the background, you can actually see the aviary. And at the bottom, the early stages of the desert garden. Anyway, let me tell you the story of the origin of the Huntington Desert Garden as told by the legendary William Hertrick, Mr. Huntington's first head gardener, later superintendent of buildings and grounds, who Henry hired in 1904, who retired 44 years later but continued to function in an advisory capacity until his death in 1966. A 60-plus year career whose impact on the institution was profound. Quote, this is Hertrick, quote, just as the grading for the palm garden began to take shape, this was in 1905, I requested permission to establish a cactus garden. Mr. Huntington evidenced complete surprise and questioned why I thought anyone could possibly be interested in such a garden, admitting that he himself thoroughly disliked all types of cacti. His dislike was readily understandable when he explained that it all dated back to the time he had supervised construction work for the Southern Pacific Railroad on the Arizona desert. While backing away from some grading equipment, he had had his first painful and never to be forgotten introduction to the prickly cactus. I explained to Mr. Huntington that Southern California's climatic conditions would be most advantageous toward assembling such a collection, which should include species and varieties from the entire continent. I also pointed out that this planting would be unique, made up solely of a family of American plants which would have definite scientific and therefore educational value. Mr. Huntington finally evinced real interest in the subject and soon agreed to the idea. This anecdote tells us several things fundamental to understanding Henry Huntington's personality. Excuse me. The first is his willingness to be persuaded by a good argument, especially if delivered by an expert whose opinion he trusted. The second, and to my mind most important, along with the next reason, is his interest in the thing that was unique. The third, equal in importance to the second, is his attraction to the scientific and therefore educational nature of his project, the seeds, pun intended, of which were planted at the outset of his acquisition of the San Marino Ranch. The fourth is his interest in creating an indigenous American collection of plants, though it became global soon enough, that complemented his American book collection and his proposed collection of American art, complementing his English collections in each area, books and art. It's this hybrid nature of the project, art, books, plants, that sets the scheme apart from anything at the time in California, perhaps anywhere other than a great university. When Henry's magnificent Myron Hunt-designed Beaux-Arts mansion was completed in 1911, the proximity of the desert garden to a house inspired by 18th century French neoclassical architecture would perhaps have seemed to the casual visitor strange. I say perhaps because immediately upon the house's completion, Henry began the now famous Japanese garden, installed in 1912. Strange would thus seem to be a relative concept at a time and in a place where all styles and all cultures seemed to jostle noisily for attention. To give you a proper sense of this as it was understood in the early years of the 20th century, let me quote from the funniest of all send-ups of LA's infamous architectural eclecticism, written by the great critic Edmund Wilson, albeit some years later in 1930. And on the screen from considerably earlier moment, but not that much earlier, are two buildings, Del Miradero in Glendale. It's now the Brand Library, built in 1904, and the Feñas House, the first Feñas House from 1897, the second in Pasadena. The second Feñas House is now the Museum of Pasadena History, and it's in a Beaux-Arts style, just like Mr. Huntington's mansion, although it just predates the mansion. They were being built almost simultaneously. Anyway, let me quote Edmund Wilson. I love this quote. Now we motor agreeably and speedily through the beautiful residential boulevards. The residential people of Los Angeles are cultivated, enervated people, lovers of mixturesque beauty, and they like to express their emotivation in homes that imaginatively symphonize their favorite historical films, their best beloved movie actresses, their luckiest numerological combinations, or their previous incarnations in old Greece, romantic Egypt, quaint Sussex, or among the high priestesses of love in amoristic old India. Here you will find a Pekingese pagoda made of fresh and crackly peanut butter. There a snow-white marshmallow igloo. There a toothsome pink nugget in the Florentine manner, rich with embedded pecans. There rears a pocket-sized replica of heraldic Warwick Castle, and there drowses a naughty old Nance. A wee, wonderful Swiss shilly-shally snuggles up beneath a bountiful bougainvillea, which is by no means artificially colored, and a hot little hacienda, a regular enchilada con queso, with a roof made of rich red tomato sauce, hardly lifts her long-lashed lavender shades on the soul of old Spanish days, end quote. Isn't that great? It was more than was necessary, but I really couldn't resist it. It's one of the great lampoons of unbridled architectural promiscuity, as well as a brilliant pastiche of the over-the-top language of both realtors and evangelists. Of course, LA in 1930 was an easy target for the snarky-penned Wilson, and as one imagines LA in the 2000 teens would also be. We have, however, strayed from our path. Let's briefly stroll back to and through the Huntington's Japanese garden. The startling, and you're seeing on the right the Japanese bell tower circa 1913. On the left, obviously, is the Beaux-Arts mansion. The startling contrast between Huntington's grand Beaux-Arts villa and the Japanese garden, completed at Henry's insistence before he and Arabella took up residence in the house, which only happened in January of 1914. They'd been married in July of 13, although Henry had been planning it since at least 1906, after divorcing his first wife. At any rate, the startling contrast between house and garden was noted at the time. It is difficult to imagine a sharper contrast, wrote the author of Stately Homes of California, published in 1915, than that which exists between the architecture of this Japanese house, and we'll get to the house in a moment, and that of the residence itself. Both are charming in their way as representing a high development of highly divergent standards and ideals. So how did the Huntington Japanese garden come about? Most of you probably know that the house was bought from a bankrupt Asian art dealer and transported to the San Marino Ranch from Pasadena. That dealer was a man named George Turner Marsh, and he was one of the best known and most influential Asian, or what would then have been called Oriental, art dealers in America, as well as being one of the most influential Japanese garden designers. He had designed the Japanese garden for the Midwinter International Exposition in San Francisco in 1894, which took place while both Henry and Arabella were living there, albeit in different houses. In fact, he reportedly sold a group of Japanese artworks to Arabella 4 years earlier in 1890, so she would have presumably been acquainted with him. And he had designed and opened a lavish Japanese tea garden in Pasadena in 1904, at the corner of Fair Oaks in California, across the street from where the Huntington Hospital now stands. And that's what you're seeing on the screen. By 1911, the garden was in serious economic trouble, and a buyer had stepped forward to acquire the entire enterprise. That buyer was Henry Huntington, and it was Hertrick who had discovered that the entire enterprise was for sale. In fact, Henry was in New York at the time. So it was bought in its entirety, and with the help of 4 crews of men was transported lock, stock, and barrel, or rather plants, buildings, and sculpture, to the Huntington Ranch. Even its Japanese proprietors were leased, a Mr. and Mrs. Goto, who stayed on to tend the garden, appearing in Japanese costume on special occasions, visits by important guests, for instance, at the request of Henry and Arabella. This would have seemed like charming local color to the Huntingtons and their guests, but to us it smacks of paternalism and colonialism. And there, in fact, is the top Mr. and Mrs. Fujio in the Marsh Japanese garden circa 1903. They preceded the Gotos, and then when they left, the Gotos took over. Because the garden in Pasadena lasted about 8 years, 7 or 8 years. And then the Japanese house from the Marsh garden on the right, and the gardens, the Huntington Gardens as they appear today. You see it's exactly the same house. This colonialist impulse, particularly endemic in its forthrightness to the early 20th century, is so overt as to be almost comic, and it helps partially to explain the wide-ranging, even globally representative aspirations that Henry had for his grand initiative, his world within a world, the gardens representing what would become a gradually international focus, first specimens from around the world, then cultural theme gardens, though always in good taste, never succumbing to the vulgarities of bush gardens across town on Orange Grove and Millionaire's Row, and we'll get to that in a moment. The library and art collection and their focus on Anglo-American culture, reflecting the widely held belief in the historical superiority of that culture and its centrality to America's foundational myth as American influence and power in international affairs were in the ascendant, rising to an unprecedented level of jingoism during the First World War. Nor was the Japanese garden as a feature of grand manner unique to Mr. Huntington. The Wattles garden, Gordon Wattles' mansion, Juanita is on the left, and on the right is a view of his Japanese garden from 1907. The Wattles Garden on 49 acres below Runyon Canyon were one of LA's first tourist attractions, boasting among several theme gardens, Italian, Spanish, rose, as well as a palm court and orchards, a significant hillside Japanese garden on the right that just predates Mr. Huntington's. The difference, of course, is that unlike Huntington's, the Wattles Japanese garden was then open to the public. The mission-style Wattles Mansion on the left, built in '07, was designed by Myron Hunt and Elmer Gray. A year later, construction of the Huntington Mansion would begin, also, as you know, by Myron Hunt and Elmer Gray. Seeing the Huntington in Mr. Huntington's day at the top, the mansion, and then as it appears now. Oral tradition holds that the Japanese garden was intended as a wedding gift for Arabella, and it would indeed have been considered fashionable, carrying with it significant prestige value. This certainly makes sense, as it makes equal sense that the house, too, is essentially an elaborate wedding present, or lure, as it were, for Arabella, who had a strong hand in its design and decoration, even though she and Henry would not marry until 2 years after it was completed, and would not, which was in 1911, and would not move into it until 1914. Indeed, while Henry's original conception for the house is really nothing but, quote, his quote, a library with a few rooms about it, thus the capacious size of its large library, while this reflects his initial desire to make it essentially a container for his books, once his beloved Arabella got involved, and he was deeply in love with her, and had been for many years, as Shelley Bennett has astutely observed, the way to Arabella's heart was through property. At any rate, once Arabella got involved, locating art and furnishings abroad for the house, she was then living in Paris, at the time, and acting as his buyer-decorator, with her dealer Joseph Duveen advising, or more accurately, probably dictating, the house soon began to reflect Arabella's taste far more than Henry's. Even Henry's library suffered, Arabella having found for the house a suite of 5 large 18th century French Beauvais tapestries bought by Henry in 1909 from Duveen, whose dimensions necessitated the annoying and costly alteration of the already custom-designed library paneling. Accommodating them meant a significant loss of space for Henry's books. And on the subject of the tapestries, it's general knowledge, of course, that they cost more than the house did. They were $577,000. This is in 1909. The house was $480,000. Henry had earlier rejected a formal Italian garden proposed by his architect Myron Hunt, and you have a sense of that in the image at the top on the left of the south side of the south terrace that suggests that the beginnings of an Italian formal garden. Instead, he had his gardener William Hertrick plant around the house a large number of exceedingly rare cycads, which is one of the oldest plants on Earth. It's so old its fossil record dates back 300 million years. Cycads grow very, very slowly. You have to really be thinking of the future when you plant cycads. And some have been known to live to be 1,000 years old. On the bottom image, the old postcard, adjacent to the loggia and surrounding the McMonnies fountain, you'll see cycads where they were planted partially around the house instead of a formal garden. Henry's fascination with cycads and his desire to build a first-rate cycad collection, as well as to plant many of his specimens immediately around the house, but especially adjacent to the loggia, that's in the background, you see that to the left, suggest a few things. First, they highlight his love of the rare and the unique, a pattern that can be seen in all his areas of collecting. Second, they display a nuanced approach to the conventional, not surprising given his attraction to rarity. Nuanced in that he was utterly conventional in behavior and comportment, and he was happy to subscribe to conventional modes of signaling or enhancing status through prestige goods, as in his decision to build a Beaux-Arts villa on his ranch, rather than, say, a green and green bungalow, as the Gambles were doing across town. Third, and most importantly, they underscore his interest in the future, in creating a monument that would outlive him, measured by hundreds rather than scores of years. Equally, in his business dealings, we see this visionary streak, this remarkable belief in the future, a future he knew he wouldn't see, but whose seed he was eager to plant. He was LA's greatest booster, and for good reason. He was creating LA out of nothing, or out of a much smaller kernel than it eventually became. And what you see here is the red car, the Pacific Electric Railway System, and it's the long arms of its reach across the basin, which really established the street grid for Los Angeles and the development of Los Angeles. He prophesied in 1905, when there were about 175,000 people in LA, that there would be 1 million by the time he died. He died in 1927, so he didn't see the 1930 census, but the 1930 census, in the 1930 census, there were 1.2 million people in Los Angeles. That's Los Angeles, the city, that did not count the greater area around Los Angeles. Anyway, back to Henry's Gardens. One of Henry's friends wrote in 1911 let's stay with that. Wrote in 1911, what his house at that estate contains in treasures of art, his grounds more than duplicate in priceless and strange plants. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that Henry was unique in collecting cycads, or for that matter, in creating a desert garden. Let us then take a brief motor tour of some of the gardens of the rich in Los Angeles of the fin de siècle. So I'm showing you Andrew McNally's residence and gardens in Altadena in 1888, which were renowned. I'm showing you Paul Delongpre's residence and gardens. He was the flower painter, the French flower painter. This is 1901. He built a Moorish hacienda and a lush flower-filled garden, which became a stop on the first interurban electric railway line. It became a famous attraction, especially famous for its roses. And of course, it was a business proposition because he would show his guests the beautiful gardens filled with roses, then invite them to his studio, which was filled with his beautiful watercolors of roses, and he'd sell them. Or Arthur Letz's house and gardens in Las Feliz. This was around 1907. The house was built by 1907. Now, Letz was extremely wealthy, a financier. He was the founder of the Broadway department store. Then Bullock's. He was the money behind Bullock's. He didn't put his name on it because he didn't want competition from the Broadway. He was the initial developer of Westwood, of the embryonic UCLA, and of Holmby Hills. His estate was on 100 acres. His gardens, which were worked on by, yet again, Myron Hunt and Elmer Gray, were open to the public. There was a sunken garden, there was a formal garden, a tropical garden, a cactus garden. He was particularly famous for his cactuses. There he is. In fact, his cactus collection was known nationally, if not internationally. And like Paul Delongpre's garden, his gardens were also a stop on the Pacific Electric Railway. He wanted the gardens to be preserved after his death, but his son-in-law, who happened to be Harold Jantz, that name may be familiar to those of you who have a familiarity with Westwood, but his son-in-law, Harold Jantz, persuaded his widow not to honor the desire. In fact, he'd left $15,000 to keep the gardens up per a year, $15,000 a year to keep the gardens in good condition. But her son-in-law, Harold Jantz, or Jantz rather, convinced her to sell and subdivide the land, and then he subdivided it. Let's famously competed with Edward Doheny for the best and most exotic specimen plants, palms, cycads, cactus, etc. Jan's name is still, if you look at manhole covers in Westwood, you'll see the name still there, because he took then the mantle of completing the development of Westwood. So, these I'm showing you, this is the Pasadena Gardens of Adolphus Busch. You're seeing the sunken gardens in both of these. There was an upper garden and a lower garden. He was co-founder, obviously, of the Anheuser-Busch Brewery in St. Louis. He was one of the richest men in America. He'd built a winter house on South Orange Grove in 1904. It was sort of the beginning of Millionaire's Row. It covered 30 acres, and it opened in 1905. Had a sunken garden, a pond, a flock of sheep, exotic birds, a Bavarian-style old mill, which still survives. He had a thatched roof mystic hut, and most unusually, although akin to similar gardens in Germany, vignettes of ceramic figurines depicting scenes from the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales. And there's one on the left of those. The image on the right is just because I love the Costin Ostrich Farm in South Pasadena, and I just couldn't pull it. I won't be talking about it. They did have a Japanese tea house, though, and that goes back to the 1890s, maybe late 80s. So, but the original Busch Gardens were the prototype, as you probably know, for the garden as amusement/theme park in America, and all roads lead from the original Busch Gardens to Disneyland, Six Flags Over Texas, and, well, Busch Gardens, because Busch Gardens is still around. Huntington seems clearly to have developed his specimen garden, although he never explicitly said so, at least partially, even if only unconsciously, as a corrective to what he must have seen as the vulgarity of Busch Gardens, a few short miles from his ranch. Although he was by no means immune to the economic advantage of making money from entertainment, witness his buying and radically improving the Wentworth Hotel through the services of Myron Hunt and Elmer Gray, and the landscaping expertise of his head gardener, subsequently named the Huntington Hotel, and now, in a much altered state, the Langham Hotel. The Huntington Hotel boasted in 1913 a 9-hole golf course, spacious gardens, and a restored old mill, think of Busch Gardens, as clubhouse, as well as, significantly, a Japanese streamside garden in the canyon below the still standing covered bridge, and you see that part of that garden in the image at the lower right. There's the hotel and that covered bridge, which still stands. And then 2 more images of the Japanese garden. The Los Angeles Times claimed that the grounds would likely eclipse the world-famed sunken Busch Gardens in magnificence. Of course, as Kendall Brown has pointed out, the hotel, unlike Huntington's private estate, would also be an exceptional advertisement to the public of Huntington's cultivated taste. Now let's engage in another exercise in contrasts. On the left, for the 0.001% of those in the audience visiting from Mars, is the Gamble House, built in 1908, and one of Charles and Henry Green's masterpieces. Indeed, the word masterpiece, so abused, seems insufficient to its sublimity. It is a symbol of architectural progressivism. On the right, built in 1911, is Eric Gill's marvelous Multimore House in South Pasadena, and thank the gods, still standing. It is also a symbol of architectural progressivism. Like chronological bookends, these 2 now classic harbingers of modern architecture as it would be defined in the hothouse of Southern California in the early years of the 20th century, like bookends then, these 2 progressive harbingers flank Henry Huntington's Beaux-Arts manse, begun in 1908 and completed in 1911. Now, admittedly, we have the perfect vision of hindsight, and equally admittedly a Huntington, whether Henry or Arabella, so new to great wealth. It was only Uncle Collis who had created the fortune after all and provided the foundation for Henry's success. So the Huntingtons, so new to great wealth, so keen to select the approved signals of prestige, could not have selected either of these 2 styles, the Eric Gill style, stripped-down modernism, the Gamble House style, ranch house, casual living style that would prophesy the future. Anyway, could not have selected either of these 2 styles for the house that was to embody their legacy. It goes without saying that only one of these interiors is an appropriate setting for the likes of Blue Boy and his aristocratic kin. I think you can tell which it is, the Gamble House interior at the top and Beaux-Arts Mansion on the bottom. This is made effortlessly obvious with an image of Huntington staff cavorting in the mansion on what, for us, is just another average day. In contrast, I think we all know what type of person lives in the Gamble House. So for those of you who are too young to remember Back to the Future, from 1985, that's Michael J. Fox running up the drive of Gamble House, where Doc Brown lives, played by Christopher Lloyd, and Michael J. Fox, of course, his character is Marty McFly. Anyway, neither for the same reason would Henry or Arabella have collected contemporary or near-contemporary art, although there are some minor exceptions to this. I'm just showing you a Mary Cassatt pastel that was owned by Henry, acquired after Arabella's death. But it's something she would have had no difficulty with. And on the right, I'm not showing you a Sorolla that he owned, but Sorolla was a painter that Henry admired, and Archer, Arabella's son, was Sorolla's biggest collector and gave a massive collection of Sorollas, and Sorolla was huge at the time, as big if not bigger than Sargent, and very much Sargent-like. He appealed particularly to the Gilded Age taste, and was a brilliant painter, at any rate, but not a modernist painter. At any rate, Archer gave the collection to the Hispanic Society in Manhattan, which he founded. He also gave Goya's and other important Spanish artists. Arabella bought Barbizon school paintings. I'm showing you Corot on the left, so out of fashion that even we don't have a color photograph of it, although it's hanging, 500 feet from here. And on the lower right, Constant Troyon's Milking Time of 1847. Henry, at Arabella's encouragement, bought the painting he loved, the Jules Breton from 1895, The Last Gleanings, on the upper left. And continuing in that tradition, because we feel it's important to continue traditions here, we recently acquired, just a few years ago, Constant Troyon's Sunshine and Shadows, which hangs beside the Huntington's Barbizon paintings on the second floor of the mansion. But these were safe, officially and socially approved choices. In 1907, the year in which these Barbizon pictures were bought by Henry and Arabella, let's look at what was being produced in the very city in which Arabella was living, that is, Paris. And in 1911, the year the Huntington Mansion was completed and ready for installation, here again is what was taking place at the cutting edge of artistic production in Arabella's beloved Paris. In fact, these are from 1924. In fact, Arabella and Henry's self-fashioning, that is the way in which they wish the world or their world to perceive them, makes a fascinating contrast with the way in which, for example, a figure of the avant-garde like Gertrude Stein wished the world to see her. And what's particularly extraordinary is the difference in dates, which you would expect to be reversed in these two images. Picasso's Gertrude Stein from 05-06 and Oswald Burley, who was a society painter, so it makes perfect sense that he would paint in a conventional style from 1924. Anyway, notwithstanding or in spite of the nearly 20-year distance between these two paintings, the official style of the society painter Burley's portraits of Henry and Arabella, so hopelessly out of fashion by 1924, Picasso's of Gertrude Stein still feeling radical and fresh. It goes without saying that the Steins, Gertrude and her brother Leo, did not socialize with the Huntingtons. Indeed, the truly bizarre idea of their socializing makes one long for Steve Martin to write an imaginary play on the subject. Nor did other maverick collectors of contemporary art of the time, there weren't many, the Cohn sisters of Baltimore, for example, nor did they socialize with the Huntingtons. One man Henry did know, however, was the businessman William Preston Harrison, originally from Chicago, and one of the original benefactors of the Los Angeles Museum of History, Science, and Art, founded in 1918 or 19, later to become the Los Angeles County Museum of Art would break away from it and become a separate entity. Harrison had moved to LA in 1918. He was one of the few collectors in town interested in contemporary art, but primarily American and French. There you see a very sedate portrait of him on the left. It's deliberately conservative because he knew it was going to hang in a public place. He assumed that was going to be LACMA, which owns it. And that is his wife, Ada Harrison, on the right, by Robert Henry. They collected Henry, which meant they were collecting contemporary American art, Henry being one of the key figures of the Ashcan school, along with people like Bellows and Sloane. These are two of the objects that Harrison collected, ultimately giving his collection, which formed the core of the modern collection at LACMA, to LACMA. On the left, Chagall, on the right, Modigliani. He had an agent in Paris buying for him. One other collector of contemporary art, and one of the greatest, also like Harrison from Chicago, a man named Arthur Jerome Eddy, also lived in Pasadena in a magnificent and progressive arts and crafts house designed by Frederick Rierig in 1906 and criminally torn down in 1972. Eddy had always been interested in the avant-garde, but the Armory Show in New York in 1913 was seminal for him, as it was for many other American foundational collectors of contemporary art. Unlike many others, Eddy's interests also encompassed Kandinsky, that's a Kandinsky that he owned now at the Art Institute of Chicago on the right, and the German Expressionists. That would have been considered very radical and very unusual. We think of Galka Shire as really having created that taste in Pasadena, but here, a generation before, was Eddy doing it. As well as Duchamp, who he knew personally, Brancusi, Picabia, and his deeply intelligent book, a book Eddy wrote, radical for its time, Cubists and Post-Impressionism, published in 1914, was one of the first positive treatments of contemporary art at the time. And that Picabia on the right is a Picabia that he owned, also and bought right out of the Armory Show that now is in Philadelphia. So thinking of the Harrisons, their collecting of Ashcan School, Robert Henry, et cetera, brings us to the collections as the American collections, or makes me think of the American collections at the Huntington as they are today. And what I want to do is just go through some of the, I'm not going to go through the collection, I'm going to go through some of the things that we've acquired in the past few years as a way of continuing or building upon the great bequest of Virginia Steele Scott that gave us a core collection of American art upon which we build. That really, she has helped us to establish what Mr. Huntington had prophesied, or at any rate had hoped would ultimately happen. So what you're seeing on the left is a wonderful George Bellows, late George Bellows in '24, acquired in 2013, and a George Lukes, the Breaker Boys, also acquired in 2013. The growth of the collection in the last 3 years was prompted by the expansion of the American galleries. In July 2014, it converted the rear portion of the Urburu Gallery into gallery space and gave us an additional 5,600 square feet of gallery space, which we had to fill. I'm showing you Edward Hopper, not because we acquired it recently. Thank God we couldn't have. It would be out of any museum's range now, but happily in 1983. And this really is one of the great Hoppers. And for me, this represents the essence of Virginia Steele Scott. Without her bequest, we could not have acquired this painting. It happens to be on the Hopper postage stamp, as most of you know. It's a truly great painting, and not only that, it's the only one that I am aware of in a public collection in Southern California. So as recent significant additions to the American collections, I think we've been busy. This marvelous Reginald Marsh fresco that we bought in its tempera on concrete that we acquired in 2013. Milton Avery and Helen Lundeberg, more recently in 2015. This spectacular Arthur Dove from 1941, which helps to begin to fill gaps in our collections of abstraction. And then some interior reviews of those galleries when they were open. They have been closed since the beginning of the third extension of the American galleries, which is coming to a conclusion fairly soon. What we've done is to take fill the space between the original Scott building and the Virginia Steele Scott and Urburu Gallery building designed by Fred Fisher. We've filled the space that still existed between those two buildings. I'll show you images of that later. But because of that, we were forced to deinstall a number of the American galleries, largely because of heavy machinery that caused serious vibrations. We were concerned about the safety of the art, so we took it all off view. So only half the gallery has been open. We're gradually reopening it. That's a view into the 1920s gallery, the Ashcan School with Bellows, Lukes, and John Sloan visible, and there's also Deck Art, Silver, and Sculpture. This is a view of a gallery that commingles American modernism, Hopper, Dove, O'Keeffe, Dickinson, Sheeler, with California plein air painting, Guy Rose, Granville Redmond, Edgar Payne, and some Western art. We wanted to tell that story as a kind of whole rather than segregating, which is normally done, the plein air painting, as if it were inferior to the modernist painting. We wanted to clarify that story is taking place simultaneously. Then an interior view of the pre-war gallery with our great Sergeant Johnson screen in the background, Sergeant Claude Johnson, the African-American artist. Same gallery below that with the Marsh locomotive visible in the distance to the left, and the post-war gallery visible through the doorway. What you see, those two little blocks are Tony Smith's sculpture. Growing the post-war American collection, difficult as that is, has been within reason a priority. It's very difficult. It's impossible to acquire great works of contemporary, post-war art rather, any longer. They're simply too expensive. So we depend upon gifts for much of what we receive, and we've been very fortunate in that respect. And we also feel strongly about California painting. In these two instances, Emerson Wolfer from 1960 and Lee Mulliken on the right. The Emerson Wolfer was a gift. The Peyote Camdel has been part gift, part acquisition. And then I'm showing you them on view when they were on view. They're not at the moment. When they were on view in the large post-war gallery. There's Tony Smith's 4WA from 1969, acquired in 2013. Rarity, a Tony Smith painting from around 1959-60, acquired in 2013. Frederick Hammersley's Seesaw from 1966, acquired in 2013. And of course the Robert Rauschenberg Global Loft Spread 1979, which was acquired in 2012. Rauschenberg famously said, at least famously for us, said that it was his experience when he was brought to the Huntington. I think he was in the Army, he was a very young man. When he was brought to the Huntington, had very little experience of museums. His seeing Blue Boy, he's on record as saying this, his seeing Blue Boy, Pinky, and Sarah Siddons as the tragic muse made him realize that he could be an artist. And I've never been able to wrap my mind around that. Okay. Anyway, we love it. It's a great thing. And artists are often inspired by the Huntington, and sometimes we know about it and sometimes we don't. One in particular, an African-American living young artist named Kehinde Wiley, grew up in Los Angeles, and his mother would drop him off when she was doing graduate work, and his mother would drop him and his brother off at the Huntington during the day because their neighborhood wasn't particularly safe, and she didn't want to leave them alone. And he became entranced with the collection, and he gives full credit to the Huntington as being the seed that planted his whole career, and that's an emblematic painting of his style. There's Kehinde Wiley. It's Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. You can tell I'm a poor speller, and you see what he's looking at. Just as one example, I put up our George Romney, Jeremiah Millis. And he has a retrospective coming up. Actually, it happened at Brooklyn, and they organized it, the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It's on its way to Seattle. It's going to be in Seattle shortly, or it's already opened. Showing you here an interior view of the smaller post-war gallery with the Tony Smith, the Frederick Hammersley. There's the Tony Smith painting, and the Rauschenberg in the distant background. There's the Brillo, Warhol Brillo box on the right. And our most recent gift of post-war art, thanks to Lawrence and Carol Priddy, who are here tonight. This is a spectacular painting by Richard Estes, the father of photorealism, an early work, and we were thrilled to get it, and it's a perfect fit with our Warhols in particular, but just our post-war art collection in general, and it's on view right now in a small gallery of recent acquisitions in the American galleries. Another area that represented a major gap for us that we've been trying to fill is that of African-American art. And on the left, you're seeing a wonderful gift from Sandy and Bram Dijkstra in 2013 of Charles White Soldier. Charles White lived in Altadena. The Art Institute of Chicago is now organizing a major retrospective of his work, and it's about time. On the right, another Sergeant Johnson. We have the big screen, but last year, through the generosity of the Art Collectors Council, we were able to acquire this beautiful Head of a Boy from around 1928. There's the Sergeant Johnson screen from 2011. As an example of outdoor art, we were recently given this marvelous Doyle Lane, another African-American artist who died in the early aughts. This is the Pasadena Mutual Savings and Loan mural. It was in the Pasadena. It's now, I think, a Citibank across from the Pasadena Post Office. It's from 1964. And we were that it was going to be removed, and it was unknown what was going to become of it, and we were offered it as a gift, and we not only gladly accepted it, but immediately installed it in the new education courtyard. The reason our American works on paper is so rich is due to very generous donors like Hannah and Russ Kully. Hannah has been collecting American prints for years, and she's been giving us not dozens, but hundreds of them over the years, and of the most superb quality. I just threw one slide up to give you a sense of the parameters, because she starts in about the teens and goes up to the 30s. George Bellows on the left, Robert Gwathmey on the right. But it's because of very generous donors that we have that our collections are as rich as they are, and we actually have a very important now collection of American works on paper to complement our paintings. So, jumping into the British side of the house and the continental side of the house, what we've been doing there, of course, is filling gaps, building on strengths, building on foundations, and there are some significant gaps, even in the 18th century. Henry Fuseli, one of the greatest artists of 18th century England, would not have appealed to Huntington. It was not a Huntington taste, but it represented a major lacuna in the collection. We found a great painting of a classic subject, The Three Witches, from Macbeth, in a couple of years ago, and we were able to acquire it. Due to the generosity of Marianne and the late John Sturgeon, we've also been adding, in this case, 2 promise gifts, significant works of 18th century painting that brilliantly complement the Huntington's collection to our holdings. that Anton von Maren is also from Marianne and John Sturgeon. Where'd that go? Well, there should have been a slide in there of Volaire, but it's gone. This machine is a way of playing games. It's like there's a gremlin or something. And anyway, doesn't matter. I showed you 2 French paintings, but they're not on view. I mean, they're not on, they're on view in the house. You can go look at them on the second floor in the Grand Tour Gallery. In terms of works on paper for British art, I just wanted to show you this George Romney sketchbook. Again, very rich collections of British works on paper, drawings, sketchbooks, etc. This makes our 4th sketchbook of Romney, which means hundreds of Romney drawings, and very, very important way of looking at how the artist's mind thinks. And many of these subjects are, in fact, Shakespearean, so they complement the library as well. And this was a very recent purchase just last year. I want to show you a John Marin drawing that we acquired. Beautiful, classic subject, very Turneresque. But along with it, a John Minton. Now that might strike you as rather odd, because John Minton, I don't expect you to know the name, but he's a British artist. This is from 1948, not 1848. It's a 20th century work. Who knew we had 20th century British art? Do we? Well, yes, we do. But the reason you don't know it is that it's almost all on paper, and so it almost never gets seen because, of course, paper is light sensitive, and we have to rotate works on paper, and we don't have a lot of space to show them. Nevertheless, I'm showing you 2 examples, a C.R.W. Nevinson on the left, a Burra on the right. Nevinson was one of the original vorticists. Vorticism in Britain was equivalent to, say, Futurism in Italy, and Cubist in influence, etc., like constructivism in Russia, et cetera. It was one of those movements, but it gradually, the World War I more or less kills it, and he moves into still modernist style, but out of vorticism. Burra is a little bit later, and has become incredibly impossible to acquire now. His works are so expensive, these big gouaches that he did, and so it's very fortunate that the one on the right was actually acquired in 1975 when it was still affordable. My predecessors were very prescient in this regard. There's a Paul Nash, another one of the great World War I painters, British World War I painters, one of the great modernists whose style again changes over time. Here he's in the late 20s and his style is surrealist. On the right, David Bomberg, who I think is the greatest British artist of the first half of the 20th century, British painter of the first half of the 20th century. And that work, Outskirts of Alora, Spain from 1935, is interesting because what we are hoping to acquire, which is, and this painting is hanging right now in the Constable Gallery in the mansion, is this marvelous David Bomberg Slopes of Navao, Picos de Europa, from 1935, and you'll see that they're exactly the same year and almost exactly the same place. It's when he's traveling in the north of Spain before he flees the Republican Army, goes back to Britain. At any rate, Bomberg is a extraordinary painter who comes out of the tradition of Constable. That's that painterly, that very painterly brushstroke, the attention to atmospheric conditions, etc. It's a very English thing, but it's very strong in Bomberg. Now, 2 paintings, and let me preface this by saying that because we have British works on paper from the 20th century, we have a 20th century British collection. I think the collection of paintings and sculpture that's seen 24/7, that are always on view, should also be enter the 20th century, that the 19th century collections should expand into the 20th century. This is a growth opportunity for us that makes a great deal of sense for us, for the Huntington, based on the core of its collections, and less sense for any other institution, and it's what can make us different than those other institutions in Southern California. So I believe very strongly in doing that, and we've started doing it to the extent that we can, because that's also become a wildly expensive endeavor. You're looking at a Mark Gertler, one of the great early 20th century modernists. If anyone's ever read Aldous Huxley's Chrome Yellow, he's the painter in Chrome Yellow. At any rate, this is his portrait of Dora Carrington on the left, and we were, this from 1912. She was also a terrific early 20th century British painter. They both happened to commit suicide, because when you were in Bloomsbury, that seems to be what you did. And on the left is Duncan Grant's Vase of Flowers. You see the Cubist influence in 1913, but he's one of the key figures of Bloomsbury, the Bloomsbury school, not school, but group. There's Gertler. That's his most famous painting, Merry-Go-Round, which is in the Tate from 1916. And there's Dora. She was a crazy gal. And she was She was deeply in love, well, we'll get to that in a moment. There's Duncan Grant. That drawing on the right is ours. So we actually have a Grant. So adding that painting, the pastel on the right. So having a painting made a great deal of sense for us by the same artist. So what are we missing? Well, we're missing Vanessa Bell, for one thing, in terms of Bloomsbury Group painters. I'm showing you just representative examples of these artists' work to give you a sense of it. On the left, we're also missing Dora Carrington. That's her portrait of Lytton Strachey. I was about to tell you, she committed suicide. She shot herself in 1932, shortly after Lytton Strachey had died of cancer. She was greatly in love with him, even though he was gay. They lived together. She lived with him and his partner, and that was Bloomsbury. You know the famous line of Dorothy Parker about the Bloomsbury Group. They live in squares, they paint in circles, and they love in triangles. That's a great line. Vorticism. We'll never have vorticism. Unless someone gives us vorticism, we'll never have it. These things have become completely impossible to find. They're not impossible to find, they're impossible to buy. They're so expensive. But I'm showing you Wyndham Lewis. We do have very good Wyndham Lewis in the library, of course. He started a very important magazine or journal in the early 20th century. We have both copies of that. It didn't last very long, but he published a lot. Bomberg's in the Hold from 1913-14, which is in the Tate. And this Paul Nash, we saw a drawing, a surrealist drawing by him in our collection a few slides ago. This great Paul Nash is also one of the great World War I painters. And for me, this represents the whole of that moment. That's also a very difficult area to collect in now. They're so valuable. At any rate, this is his very famous painting, We Are Building a New World. And yes, the title is ironic, from 1918 in the Imperial War Museum in London. And we would love to have something akin to that. Amazingly, we have no pre-Raphaelite painting. Now, why is that? That's because it was completely out of fashion in the Huntington's day. It was not revived again until the 1960s, really. So no one was looking. They were considered very old-fashioned at the time. Now they're, again, we've been priced out of the market. But we'd love to have a Dante Gabriel Rossetti. We'd love to have an Edward Burne-Jones. Burne-Jones and his fellow pre-Raphaelites yearning for another pre-industrial era, as evidenced particularly by Sidonia von Bork on the left, is a reminder that we do not, in fact, have any examples of the historical prototypes, either, of our 18th century British Grand Manner portraits. And I'm showing you two examples of those. And that actually is kind of a priority for us. We're looking for the prototypical Jacobean or Elizabethan example of that Grand Manner portraiture that so exemplifies the Huntington's collections. With one exception, and that's what I mean. These are the prototypes for what become these. With one exception, and that's our great Anthony van Dyck Anne Kirk from 1637. Of course, she's a generation later than the Elizabethan Jacobean examples I showed you earlier. She's a sort of interim moment in the evolution of the Grand Manner type and a relatively recent acquisition. But jumping back to the 20th century, the cusp of the 20th century, what might we be interested in pursuing? Walter Sickert, important member of the so-called Camden Town group in London, an early influential proponent of a continental-influenced avant-garde imported to Britain, where Sickert gives it a distinctive demotic style. Or a favorite of mine, Gerald Brockhurst, a name I don't expect anyone here to know, but a wonderful portraitist whose early work in the 19-teens is his strongest and his best. The influence of Florentine 15th century painting should be obvious, as it should also have been in Mark Gertler's earlier portrait that I showed you that we do own, although it's still awaiting an export license, the portrait of Dora Carrington. That simplicity of line, that reduction, that brilliance, limpidness of color, it's all the influence of Italian Florentine 15th century painting in the early 20th century. Stanley Spencer, another artist we'll never be able to afford, ever. So you have to give us a gift. Just showing you representative examples. That's his self-portrait, which is actually in Amsterdam at the Stedelijk. Jay, last, did you see that when you were at the Stedelijk? And two wonderful landscapes. The real sense, his work demonstrates a great sense of place. In his case, Cookham, Berkshire. His masterpiece is the size of that screen. The Resurrection is in Tate Britain. and it's set in Cookham with people from Cookham. And yes, in fact, in 1914, a very young man, he is looking at Samuel Palmer's self-portrait from 1826. An artist like Lucian Freud makes perfect sense for us. Can't afford him. There are some lacunae so obvious they hardly bear mentioning. We don't have a Henry Moore. Now, I know someone in this room has a Henry Moore, because you can't spit without hitting a Henry Moore in this town. Tabletop, we'll settle for a tabletop. We don't need a big one. And Barbara Hepworth, who's become rarer and harder to find and more expensive than Henry Moore these days. In terms of living artists, two come instantly to mind. One, Frank Auerbach, now in his 80s, and the bravura brushwork and heavy impasto of his paint, applied as thickly as cake icing, should remind you of, yes, David Bomberg, with whom he studied. And of course, David Hockney, who's the great bridge artist, neither completely English nor completely Californian. You notice I don't say American. There's nothing American about him, but there's a great deal of California in his work. He's a fascinating hybrid. This is his portrait of George Lawson and Wayne Sleep from 1972-75 that he just gave to Tate Britain. And here he is painting en plein air one of his enormous recent multi-paneled landscapes in England. You see the Constable tradition continues. Now, let's talk about something a little more controversial. So here you see the cover of Leslie Vance and Ricky Swallow at the Huntington, the catalog for that exhibition, our first contemporary intervention 2 years ago, 2012 rather. So we began this process of doing what we call interventions or installations in the mansion in 2012 with an installation of the work of Leslie Vance, the painter, and her husband, Ricky Swallow, the sculptor. And let me show you some interiors of interior views of that one gallery installation with a little spillover out of the gallery. It was just the one small gallery. It was restricted to one gallery with, as I say, a bit of spillover. It was intended to spark a dialogue between new art and old art. And Leslie and Ricky took the project extremely seriously, building a scale model of the gallery in their studio and making work in response to their immersion in the Huntington collections. There's some more interior views. This is perhaps the clearest example of that attention or that response to other works. Ricky's descending figure on the left, Ricky Swallow's descending figure on the left, is in direct response to our great 18th century bronze Diana by Jean-Antoine Houdon. The project, which was the inspiration of Catherine Hess, the Huntington's chief curator of European art, and Christopher Bedford, now director of the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis, was effective precisely because of its novelty, the first time the work of living artists had been exhibited in the mansion. In fact, I think Henry, aside from any aesthetic considerations, we can assume he would not have liked it, a fact that he would have, that I think Henry would have appreciated, given his love of the unique and the rare. He wanted what no one else has, and in the Los Angeles region, the Huntington has what no one else has. A magnificent Gilded Age mansion that doubles as an art gallery, as well as beautiful gardens. And while contemporary art is not and never will be part of the Huntington's DNA, it doesn't need to, with so many local institutions doing it and doing it well, it can do something that LA's cultural institutions cannot do in quite the same way. That is, it can look at older art through the lens of new art and vice versa, in ways that are fresh and yes, provocative, and yes, stir up a lot of feelings, both positive and negative. I know, because I get the hate mail. What we should not do, however, is make these interventions a frequent occurrence. They're noticed and they're commented on for their very novelty, and we aim to keep it that way. We conceive of these contemporary interventions in the mansion as an occasional series, the emphasis being on occasional. Now, Alex Israel. I get a lot of love mail, too. So I wanted to show you, just go through these slides quickly. Again, think about looking at old through the lens of the new through the lens of the old, creating a dialogue, sparking a dialogue between both of those, bringing in a new demographic. I mean, there's lots of things that we think hard about. We don't do these things without a great deal of thought. Okay, so in this instance, I wanted also to point out, or to take the opportunity of pointing out, the suite of Sèvres bisque porcelain figurines in the front of Sky Backdrop, both enhancing each other, the figurines enhancing the painting enhancing the figurines. I want to point that out, as well as here. in intervention of a little Alex Israel sculpture called The Big Chill with porcelain. I wanted to take the opportunity to mention the generosity of Mary Lou Boone, who's given the Huntington extraordinary examples of the finest French 18th century ceramics, thus continuing the rich tradition of the French decorative arts, which was so important to Arabella and equally important to Henry precisely because of his great love of Arabella. And then back to Alex Israel, this is a view of his mural in one of the upstairs gallery called In and Out. Now, lest you think this is a weird, unusual, anomalous kind of thing, I'm showing you Jeff Koons at Versailles in 2008. Far more radical than anything we've done. I'm showing you Ai Weiwei at Blenheim Palace in 2014-15. Lawrence Weiner, also at Blenheim Palace in 2015. How about that Damien Hirst and Mark Quinn at Chatsworth in 2011? The horse is Damien, there are actually two of them, and those other two sculptures are Quinn's. Our Waddesdon Manor, on the left is Richard Long, on the bottom Richard Serra and Sarah Lucas on the right, all commissioned by Jacob Rothschild, Lord Rothschild, for that place. And of course, Jeff Koons' Floral Puppy and Split Rocker. The Floral Puppy, you realize, is 43 feet tall, formed from a series of stainless steel armatures constructed to hold over 25 tons of soil, watered by an internal irrigation system. It can hold over 70,000 multi-hued flowering plants. And you know, I'm just saying. And okay, if you don't like it there, we'll put it there. And just in case you think that this is somehow outrageous or bizarre, need I remind everyone of one of Pasadena's oldest and most revered traditions? Going back a very long time. Anyway, what are other forms of temporary contemporary sculpture in the gardens? What might other forms look like? Richard Long, who you saw at Waddesdon, these very simple nods to the natural environment, or something a little more whimsical, like an Olive Broining Clouds from 2014 that the Public Art Fund in Central Park made. Or hell, why not James Turrell? Everybody else in town has one. And what about sound art? Now, I'm showing you something here. I have to do something technical now, so bear with me. This is a work by Osvaldo Macia, and it's called Something Going On Above My Head. It's the sounds of 2,000 birds orchestrated, and that's the chart charts those 2,000 birds orchestrated. So let me just go to that. Okay. We're going to listen to a little bit of it. Okay, you get the idea. Seems strange for the Huntington? Well, you may recall a few years ago that Louise Lawler's Bird Calls from 1972 was installed by the Lily Ponds. Try this again. I could listen to that all day. Now, what you may not realize what's going on is that she's reciting the names of all these male artists in the sound of a bird call. And it's meant to be both humorous, but also a clear recognition of the sexism that was very, very pronounced in 1972 when she was a female artist. And those are all, each of the names, people like Archway and Vito Acconci, that's what her bird calls are actually made of. That's what you were hearing her saying. Oh, and you should also remember Steve Rodin's deeply moving sound sculpture, which was commissioned by Jenny Watts for her 2012 Huntington exhibition, A Strange and Fearful Interest, Death, Memory, and Mourning in the American Civil War, is another sound sculpture that's been here. More recently, we installed Alexander Calder's Jerusalem Stable, the maquette for the stable, from 1976, which is on loan from the Calder Foundation. To some, this may seem out of place here, but let me explain to you why it isn't. How many of you know that Alexander Calder lived in Pasadena from 1906 to 1909, from the ages of 8 to 11? His father had been diagnosed with tuberculosis, and his father was also a sculptor, had been diagnosed with tuberculosis and was sent here to recover. They became a central component of the arts and crafts movement, which was very progressive. That was the center of progressivism in the West, and knew the Green and Greens, for instance. In fact, they knew Arthur Jerome Eddy very well. In fact, Eddy thought that little Alexander could use some gym lessons because he was a bit on the heavy side, and he actually paid for those lessons. Eddy was the man who had Picabia and Duchamp and Kandinsky, so they were traveling in amazing circles. Now, Calder's mother took him to the first Tournament of Roses parade in 1907, where he saw and always remembered a 4-horse chariot race, like the one you see on the screen. Years later, he created his famous circus from 1926 to 1931, which ends with the 2 charioteers, almost certainly a reflection of his experience at the Tournament of Roses. There is at least one prominent scholar who believes that the essence of Calder was born in Pasadena, and that everything he produces later is a result of what he made in Pasadena. In fact, his first 2 sculptures were made here. They still exist. They're quite beautiful little sculptures when he was 11. And his first jewelry was made here for his sister's dolls, which looks remarkably like his later jewelry. So his seminal influence on Calder, I think, makes the Jerusalem Stable a conceptually fitting addition to the campus. And its fire engine red paint and organic shape are striking, signaling that something new is afoot at this august institution. And speaking of new things, in October, we'll see the temporary installation in the garden of the Orbit Pavilion, a large walk-through sculpture shaped like a nautilus that allows the public to hear the orbits of NASA's Earth-observing fleet of satellites as they orbit the Earth. It was designed by Jet Propulsion Lab visual strategists Dan Goods and David Delgado in conjunction with Studio KCA and Shane Meerbeck. It's a work that perfectly melds art and science, and while compellingly beautiful visually and orally, it also raises important topical social issues, among them the fraught subject of surveillance in a world where privacy seems perpetually under siege, but it's a sound sculpture primarily. And while we're on the subject of the Huntington's continuing growth and evolution, and its belief in meaningful and thoughtful change in line with Henry's desire, as stated in the Huntington's indenture document of 1919, a public library, art gallery, museum, and park containing objects of artistic, historical, or literary interest for the advancement of learning, the arts, and sciences to promote the public welfare, end quote. I'd like to conclude this evening's talk with a brief tour of our latest and most ambitious project, the expansion, did I say tonight? I meant this afternoon. I gave it last night, I'm giving it again tonight. Anyway, with a brief tour of our latest and most ambitious project, the expansion of the American Galleries. And here you see an architectural rendering by Fred Fisher of the south entrance and the new glass pavilion that will lead into those galleries. Here's an architectural rendering from above, and the space that is new besides that pavilion is all of that. We're gaining 8 new galleries, something like 8,500 square feet of space with over 5,000 square feet of new gallery space. That shows you, it's all this in here. And here, this shows the renovation. We're also renovating the Scott Building. So these are all new galleries infilling the courtyard we never used, and then the new pavilion. This effectively shows the new axes. So not only are we building, expanding, renovating, but we're also making greater physical sense of the space. So wayfinding will be easier, movement through the galleries will be clearer. No, those are not the gallery colors, but that gives you a good sense of what they actually look like. And that just really shows you with clarity everything we're doing. What we've done here is break through what used to be 2 walls and created one long enfilade here. So from the Chandler wing to the Brown and Brown, the Green and Green, Brown and Brown, the Green and Green gallery, we have this marvelous long corridor with new flooring, wood flooring. It's beautiful. That gives you a better sense of what it will look like. Those are the silver cases rather, for American silver on either side. These are just images that I took recently, a couple of weeks ago. It's advanced even more since then, the outside and the inside of the entrance pavilion, some of the interiors of the galleries. So what will go into these new spaces? To give you a sense, they will be filled mostly with really amazingly great 18th and 19th century American furniture, fine art, and decorative arts. These are just a couple of examples of those sorts of things. So they will be a perfect complement to our existing collection of colonial and 19th century work in the galleries, to which they will be adjacent. Here's another example. And so we come full circle. Some of you may recall that when I first presented this pair, I mentioned that Henry, for all his obvious inability to accept the object on the right as a work of art, if, that is, he were alive to do so, would nevertheless have understood the donor's reason for giving it in 2010 to the Huntington. After all, wouldn't it have made much more sense at LACMA or MoCA? They have a context for it. They have other Warhols. I know we felt at the time when I was working for LACMA that it should have gone there, or they should have gone there. And yes, in fact, it would have made much more sense, which is precisely why the donor gave it to the Huntington. He wanted to recreate the sense of the work's newness, of its uniqueness, of its rarity. Unique, rare. These are words that Henry understood. These are words that lie at the beating heart of his great enterprise, his monument bequeathed to the people of Los Angeles, of California, of America, of the world. And there, in the rare, the unique, the perpetually renewed, and what better terms to define Henry's beloved Southern California, as well as the Huntington, than these? There is the site on which Henry Huntington and Andy Warhol could meet, shake hands, and finally agree. Thank you.